Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The Daily Decision. I'm your host, Michael Chabot. Today is the next interview in a wonderful series of books entitled Resetting Our Future. A quote from Tim Ward, publisher of Changemaker Books. At this critical moment in history, we have a rare opportunity to reset our path and avert even bigger disasters ahead. The climate crisis, inequality, unemployment, racial injustice, ecological and economic collapse, and the next pandemic. This series of short, powerful books provides a platform for pragmatic thought leaders to share their visions for big, paradigm-shifting changes and to motivate humankind to take the first difficult steps towards a better future. Today's guest, Bart Edes, is the author of Learning from Tomorrow, Using Strategic Foresight to Prepare for the Next Big Disruption. Some of Bart's accomplishments: experienced international trade and development policy specialist analyzing transformative trends reshaping Asia and the world, senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Vancouver, former senior staff at the Asian Development Bank in Manila, principal administrator for communications at the OECD in Paris, an international economist at the U.S. Commerce Department's International Trade Administration, Washington, D.C. Bart, welcome to the show.
Michael, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on The Daily Decision.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited about this. All right, guys, listening to this, strap yourself in because we got a lot to do today. And as I was telling Bart before we came on, we may have to break this into two parts because there's just so much to do. And I read the book twice. Because I wanted to go through it again, make sure I didn't miss anything. It is a really great read. And what I would say is I love the different models and the different predictions and the different things and be able to read it and kind of see what within those things are coming true. And, so it's a lot of fun. But the first question I want to ask you is, what inspired you to join this group of authors and write this book?
It was really the publisher, Michael. Tim Ward, who you quoted in your introduction. Tim's an amazing man, communications specialist, but that doesn't begin to tell his story. He has basically committed himself to helping to share insights globally on ways to make our world better. What I mean by better is more humane, inclusive, and sustainable. So Tim and I have been friends for a while. I took a course that he and his wife, Teresa, offered as communication specialists. But what led me to the book really was two things. One, I've spent most of the last 20 years based in Southeast Asia. So I'm talking to you today from Montreal, which is my home and where I am now. But for most of the last 2 decades, I've been working in Asia and the Pacific and developing countries, on a variety of development-related topics. And the thing about that region, I don't know how exposed you've been to it or our listeners, but spending all that time out there and traveling around, I felt like I was on a fast-moving, elevator, escalator, something. It's just you sensed the world changing very quickly, faster than, say, being in North America, where I was born, raised, and educated, or Europe, or other continents. The economic growth rates, the social transformation, just the evolution of countries across that vast, diverse continent was at times mind-boggling. So being in Asia gave me a sense that I was seeing the future unfold, not just for that region, but for the world. Okay, so that's one thing, where I was situated. Then fast forward, because I spent many years out there, fast forward to early 2020, mid 2020, we got hit with this upside the head, with this this horrible pandemic and all of its human, economic, and other consequences. And it gave me pause because we should have seen this coming. And in fact, a lot of people did. And I was thinking, what are some of the things that we could do to better prepare for the next big disruption, which might be another pandemic, which may or may not happen in our lifetime, but I can tell you there will be another one, or other kinds of disruptions. And we've seen them. You live long enough and you see all kinds of major disruptions that shake the world. And this is just the latest, right? And so I got to thinking about what I could share about a set of tools known collectively as strategic foresight that helps organizations, whether they be a charity, a business, a government organization, a university, even a household, help people and organizations plan better for the future. When I say the future, I'm thinking close to 10, 15, 20 years on. What might be the plausible scenarios that we could be living in? And therefore, as we're making our plans today for the future, what might we anticipate? And so this is relevant to the context of the pandemic, because about 10 years ago, and I'll just finish on this point, it's the Rockefeller Foundation, a big private foundation, financed a report on technology and development, and it set up, it elaborated 3 or 4 scenarios of what the world might be like in 10 years' time. And one of those scenarios was the world's been hit by a big pandemic. Travel was curtailed. You had government interventions and restrictions, and China came out of it relatively well. This was foreseen in a strategic foresight scenario 10 years ago. It's not the only place where we had some inkling that this could happen, but just as an example of how useful foresight can be in highlighting possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, wow, right there, just to start out. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. And I want to make sure that I lead us directly, because this really is, you nailed it so well with this, because especially here in the United States, I think we got too comfortable. I think we got a little, I don't want to use the word lazy, but maybe that's it. And not just companies, but I think we just got comfortable. And I think you would agree that we started looking into the future and preparing for things like this. I read something this morning talking about, generations before us that went through the Great Depression and the world wars and stuff like that. They had probably a little bit, maybe they didn't know the word, but they definitely had a little more probably strategic foresight because of what they had experienced. But so some things here, I'm going to throw out some terms, and I'm going to let you, from your book, and let you kind of talk about horizon scanning, scenario analysis, and then we can talk about maybe strategic foresight versus forecasting. And then I want you to really break down what strategic foresight is.
Okay, great. And one of the points that one of the thoughts I had in mind when I wrote the book is I wanted to make it accessible. I didn't want it to be overly technical. It's inevitable it gets into the weeds a little bit at certain points, but I try to keep it understandable to the layperson who is probably not that well exposed to this. So simply put, what is strategic foresight? It's think of it as a strategic, a systematic, a structured way of using ideas about the future to better anticipate change and to prepare for that. And by gaining insights through foresight, and I'll talk a bit about what are the components, what is it actually, how does it work? Mm-hmm. By gaining those insights into plausible futures, one can not only anticipate bad things happening, okay, and we've been talking about that, and I want to stress here that the future's not all about, it doesn't have to be bleak, right? There are things we should be concerned about, but it's not always bad things happening. Foresight's also highly useful for identifying opportunities.
Absolutely.
Not just avoiding or preparing for things that could go off the rails, but opportunities that may be emerging in our future. So that's kind of big picture, what is strategic foresight. A big part of foresight is scenario development, okay? And so most people are familiar with scenarios, whether or not they've heard of foresight, and they're not exactly the same, but let's just look at it this way, that foresight typically utilizes scenarios extensively. And so a big foresight exercise focused on a question, and that's how foresight usually starts. So imagine, Denver, Colorado, big city in the U.S., the government, the municipal government has to provide public services, including water provision. So it is looking at trends, like government officials at all levels all around the world. And one of those trends might be water use in the years ahead. And they use different tools, which may or may not include foresight, and which can be useful. And so they might start with a question if they decide to do a foresight study. In 2035 or 2040, what might be the demand for water? And what they'd be looking for in a foresight study is not 4.63 cubic meters per, something like that precise. They're not doing forecasting, which I'll talk about in a second, but looking at possible scenarios that could be disruptive. Think maybe climate change has made Colorado or the Denver area much drier, okay? And maybe population has increased dramatically. You'll have to look at certain assumptions and drivers of change and see how they interact. So a foresight study typically begins with a question, or an issue. And so here's an example of one, a very practical one, and the kinds of things that governments might use it for at the municipal level. What might water demand be in 15, 20 years? You look at, in the course of foresight, you look at your assumptions and you begin to examine those assumptions. Do they make sense? So that's one of the big challenges for all of us, is that as we begin planning for next year or next decade, we often don't move off of certain assumptions. And one of the great things about foresight is it gets people talking. You bring in experts in the field. In this example, might be water experts, but not only. You're bringing in people who might have experience in economics and sociology, in systems theory. So you're drawing upon, it's a multidisciplinary approach. You're drawing on different expertise in different places. And the kinds of tools you use in developing a foresight study include structured workshops, brainstorming, surveying, in-person or using online tools, which are obviously popular during the pandemic. And so you're collecting and analyzing information and perspectives, and ultimately you're trying to identify what are some of the key drivers of change and how might they interact to produce different scenarios. So at the end of the process, which can be a matter of, it can be done in a very abbreviated way in a day or two, or stretched for months, depending on one's resources and how deep one wants to get. At the end of the process, you typically end up with 3 to 5 scenarios. 4 is considered kind of the magic number, but 3, 4, or 5 different plausible scenarios, and built into each of these are explicit assumptions that have been considered and debated. And okay, this is true. Like we see population increasing, maybe at a slower rate. We know climate change is happening. A few other things that are kind of given, and I would apply to all the scenarios. But then how different factors interact, including what's happening at the federal level and between the U.S. and other countries, that could affect what's happening in Denver, going back to the water example. So these scenarios, in short, Michael, give you a chance to look at how might things move in different directions that would affect the way that you plan for providing water and at what price and how it's delivered. And here, technology, I'll just end at this point in this example. Obviously, technology would have to be seriously considered. And in the water sector, like in others, technology is changing things dramatically, including the use of automation and artificial intelligence. And that would have to be factored in if you're looking 15, 20 years on. How water would be supplied could be dramatically different than it is today. And if you're not thinking about that and just trying to do an extrapolation of today's demand, add a few people in Denver area, and that's where it's going to be, that's very short-sighted, and that's not foresight.
Yeah, agreed. And phenomenal answer, by the way. I think that, the pandemic showed us that we all have to be prepared. We all have to be looking towards the future at different scenarios. I think you would agree that the pandemic caught a lot of people unprepared.
Well, it certainly did. And, one can look at this charitably, because if it's just your average citizen, a lot of us are just trying to get by, whether we have some means or we don't. We have things going on in our lives, starting with our families. The rent has to be paid. I got to get to work. If I don't have a job, I need to find a job. There's a lot of things going on, and there are risks all around us, and we're focused on the most immediate risks, like crossing the street. Okay, the idea of pandemic, like other big risks, whether depending on where you live in the U.S. or in the world, like earthquakes or war, or we can go down the list of other types of tragedies or negative things happening. You can't, it's almost too much to absorb. So we go about our daily lives. But for those who have a responsibility to keep an eye on these things, and that includes governments and companies, actually the U.S. had a lot of things in place that should have made it prepared. Some measures of preparedness had the U.S. ranked internationally very, very high. I mean, it's a wealthy country. It's a big country. We've been through all kinds of disasters, and we'll have others. But part of it in this case was not just foreseeing what happened, but how the country responded. And there you ran into usual issue of silos, and unfortunately a very sharply partisan time in America. There were, we couldn't even agree on the facts or approach or what. There was not this kind of wartime effort when the U.S. in the past has been confronted by gigantic challenges like 9/11. The country came together, and here, unfortunately, it didn't as well as it should have, and that clearly had an impact on using the assets and the existing capacity the country did have to respond to this crisis. And that's a lesson for the future. How might the U.S. deal with this better in the future? A lot of it's not just the resources at hand, the physical and coordination mechanisms and communication channels, but how do we, socially interact? How do we come together politically? And some of that's harder to prepare for.
Yeah, and you talk about that in the book. You do mention that in some of the predictions and the foresights that were made about the politics and how the United States could have handled it better. I think what's interesting is that it magnified the what's the word I'm looking for? The differences that are affecting us here in the United States right now. And obviously, I don't want this show to be political, but it definitely magnified our separation instead of our coming together as we've done in the past. So, excuse me. I want to ask you before we really roll up our sleeves, because we're just scratching the surface right now. As I was putting this show together last night, I was thinking, man, this could easily be 2-3 hours. I mean, there's just so much in your book. What do you think stops organizations and or countries from using foresight?
There's a laundry list of reasons I could offer you, Michael. And in fact, they're in the book, as I'm sure you've seen.
Yes.
Let's start with the example of governments, because we often look in times of crisis to what is our government doing about it, whether it be the city, state, federal, what have you. And the reality is that, I was talking a moment ago about how we're busy in our own lives. Think about a senior official. So it could be a political appointee, or it could be a civil servant who's worked their way up the ranks and they have responsibility. Look, there's a lot on their plate every day. And yes, there's always in the back of their mind, there's something that could really come out of left field. I know that there's that possibility, like a pandemic, but frankly, what's on my plate in the inbox today is just overwhelming. And to try to, people are increasingly talking about this foresight stuff. And it's for the non-specialist, for somebody who hasn't been exposed to it before, it can be a little bit daunting with acronyms and terms. And the other thing too is foresight is seen oftentimes as kind of a subset of the broader field of futurism. So you have people who identify as futurists, and they try to explore what the future might hold. And as you start, and there's a bit of overlap, obviously, between foresight, looking into the future, and futurists. Foresight being a bit more structured and intended for practical application in organizations. You start talking about futuristic concepts, and you can start to lose. Either you get them really intrigued, but then it starts to sound like The Matrix or Blade Runner or some name a science fiction movie,
right?
And it starts to become a little bit removed from I've got clients, consumers, I've got voters knocking on the door, sending me emails about problem X, Y, and Z that I have to do today or tomorrow. And you're talking about, the metaverse and that we'll be interacting with avatars and there'll be drones all over the skies in the city in a few years. I mean, it just starts, it's too much to sometimes take on. So
sure.
You have busy senior officials, and this can apply to companies as well. There's a lot on their plate. And if you want to do foresight properly, you have to have some capacity. You don't necessarily need to be a big, wealthy organization. There's some tools that small and medium-sized enterprises can use, but you need some resources. And how do you justify putting the resources there to examine scenarios 10, 15 years on that might or might not happen? And how much incentive do you in your position as a decision maker, who in 2 years may be promoted or retired or what have you? It's hard to justify, okay, now we're going to set up the shop to really explore future possibilities because it's the smart thing to do. You just hope that those problems that could arise in a decade don't arise on your watch. So these are some of the reasons people pulled, decision makers and companies and governments pulled in many different directions, and resource demands placed on them, and justifying spending more time on foresight, it can sometimes be a hard sell.
I think it makes perfect sense. I call it the fishbowl effect. You know, you're in your own fishbowl, whether you're a top government official, the head of a company, the head of a department, the head of your family. You're focused on what's inside your fishbowl, right? And it makes a lot of sense. But again, we have to use history and look backwards to go forward, in my opinion. And this pandemic, you know, COVID showed us that we have to be prepared just in case. We have to have contingency plans. I look at it kind of as war planning. If you're generals, right, and you're planning for a war, you have to look at different outcomes, different scenarios. What could, if we do? Is that similar to what we're talking about here, or is that like completely different and I'm off?
You are so on,
Okay.
Michael. You hit it right on the head. So like this gets to a question I'm sure we're going to cover at some point, is who's actually using foresight?
Correct.
And you look in the US and globally, among the organizations that use it the most are those involved in security, the military, and foreign affairs, you know, taking into account, you know, international relations and the interest of your country. So you're seeing a lot of foresight used in these spaces. In the US Navy and the Coast Guard are particularly known for the use of foresight. I mean, they've been doing strategy for many years, you know, at very sophisticated levels with huge resources, but the particular foresight tools, these I've given some examples of where it's being used extensively. In fact, the U.S. Navy in the last year put out a public document, a report on with scenarios for the next 3 years or so, taking, you know, looking at the things that the Navy would look at. The Navy's there to defend the United States. What are potential risks? Where could things go? Similarly, and this is when if your audience is interested in exploring this issue and plausible scenarios in the future, a really fascinating report I can recommend is called the Global Trends Report, issued by the U.S. National Intelligence Council. And you're thinking, national intelligence, what are they publishing? You think that these guys are meeting behind, you know, 3 sets of closed, locked doors with,
Right.
secret access, and they're publishing? Yes, they are actually. So every 4 years, the NIC, National Intelligence Council, puts out a report looking at global trends in 20 years' time. And they this was the 4th year. They published this a few months ago in 2021. And the idea they had in mind was to expose the public a little bit to the work that they do. Obviously not the highly confidential stuff, but to give, you know, citizens in a democracy an idea what one of their intelligence agencies is doing, and also to expose policymakers to plausible scenarios that they should be attentive to. I mean, in addition to the private confidential briefings they'll be getting, this kind of sets a background, and it's very intriguing stuff. And some of those scenarios, I can't say you read that and you're out in the street dancing, you know, joyfully about what's coming. It tends to the dark side. But again, I come back to foresight doesn't necessarily highlight just threats. And what we may see as a plausible future in 20 years is not necessarily our future. We have the ability to shape that future collectively.
Yeah, and in the book, you talk about some of these things that were, I don't want to use the word predicted, but, you know, foreseeable or probable futures,
Sure.
plausible, right? We can use any of those words, I guess. Some things are coming true, some things are not, right? And so I don't mind plan for the worst and hope for the best type scenarios. You know, I mean, I agree. We don't want to be doomsdayers, but I think you have to plan accordingly. But so I want to talk about, we've kind of broken it down, but I made these notes here, steps for conducting foresight. So you list in the book 6 different steps. I'll read them off and then I'll let you obviously give all the background. But 1 is identify the issue. 2 is clarify assumptions. 3 is scan the horizon. I love that. I want to talk about that. 4 is map systems and explore drivers of change. 5 is prepare scenarios, and 6 is develop policy options.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of places along that route. There's plenty of places to stumble.
Of course.
We talked earlier about identifying the question, which again, at the city level can be, what's water demand going to be in our city in 20 years time? looking at our assumptions. So when we're planning about how we distribute water in the city of, in this case, Denver, what are our assumptions of how we do that? We have pipes, we have certain, water purification plants, what have you, the whole system for distributing water. And where does it come from? Oh, the water will keep coming from the mountains, no problem. Well, is that a reasonable assumption given drought and climate change? So you want to examine your assumptions. As you move along the path, you're going to begin to identify what are some key drivers of change that are shaping our world around the question around, in this case, the city. And so that can be the big stuff, again, coming back to changing climate. It can be things that are very more local. There might be, I can't say I know much about water distribution in Denver. So there might be particular local circumstances that one might, want to consider. Obviously, population, Denver's a booming city, right?
Yes, it is.
So one would think that there would be more and more demand. At the same time, I'd refer to technology. There, technologies that can affect, can regulate the distribution of water, can reduce leakage, algorithms and AI that can enhance efficiencies and help maybe reduce actually the water that's needed if it's distributed even to a larger population in a more efficient way. So you're looking at some of the drivers of change, and you're drawing again on expert opinion, not only from the particular sector, but in others, including those looking at how people interact and looking at the political questions, which way politics might go. And you reach a certain stage where you have to, that's a lot of information and analysis that you're digesting. You have to bring it down to a more manageable number of key underlying drivers of what's going to influence ultimately the provision of water and the demand on water. And so then you'll look at, oftentimes there'll be just a handful of different drivers that you're looking at, and you test out how they might interact to produce different scenarios. And the thing about scenarios is they are not very precise, like a prediction or a forecast. So let me just pause and make a distinction between forecasting and foresight. And it's not a case of one being better than the other. They're different. Forecasting is a subset of prediction. And when we think of forecasting, what's the first thing when you hear forecast? Put my book aside. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear forecast?
Forecasting numbers, the economy, the stock market, those types of things. Exactly.
So one can also talk about forecasts for the weather, but let's focus on the first thing that comes to your mind, which is often the first thing that comes to my mind when thinking about forecasting. What is the company's performance in the next quarter? We're looking at our 401ks. We want to know how that company's doing. They're talking about their forecast, and those will often be an attempt at precision. 4.7% increase in sales, profits, whatever.
Right.
Forecasting draws upon historical data and up to the moment, and it's not necessarily a straight line projection, but it's moving forward with trends from the past.
Correct.
Foresight definitely accesses data and what we've seen with our eyes and what the evidence shows and what history presents us up to this moment, but it does not limit itself to that. Nor does it try to, like with a crystal ball, predict with precision a date, a year, a time, a quarter that something will happen. Especially by the time you get 10 years out, it's much more difficult to do that. But the scenarios that are spelled out tend to be more of a narrative. So, and they are distinguished from each other. They're a little bit different. There might be some commonality that we've accepted that, the climate is likely to be more this or that in the future, but it's very unlikely to be a few other things. We're probably assuming that Denver will be still intact in 10 years' time, that unthinkable things will not happen in the next 10 years. You got to exclude some of the more fringe possibilities, right? So if something could possibly happen, but it's 1 in a billion, you're probably not. You have to bring it in a little bit, because you have plenty of space still for creativity and for you bring a little bit of imagination to this. But it's not it's not storytelling, because underlying any foresight scenario is rigorous analysis. And the scenarios that you come up with, it is unlikely that any one of those, say, 4 scenarios will actually come true as it is presented. Okay. And that's not the purpose, is to say, if you hear the 4 scenarios, pick one do you think, whichever one you think is most likely, or the one that you want. What is quite plausible, even likely, is that bits or parts of those 4 scenarios will actually prove to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to keep that in mind, is you're not picking a scenario, you're rather looking at what appears in each of these scenarios. And as I said, there might be there's some similarity in each of them, but at the end there's distinctions, important distinctions, that are assuming that drivers of change interact in different ways. For example, another one that comes to mind is, Denver's an attractive place right now as a secondary IT center.
Correct.
So, Silicon Valley still is a preeminent, center of tech in America and the world. But one trend that accelerated during the pandemic was secondary cities like Denver's, Austin, Salt Lakes, and others have really built out their IT community. You got programmers flocking to these cities for the environment, for nature, for cheaper accommodations, lifestyle, whatever. So is it, one thing that would probably be in a 10-year scenario is, does Denver look like it's going to maintain this kind of edge, that it will continue to attract capital, and this will still be an important sector? What will the economy be like? And that would influence, coming back to the water example, water demand, if people are still coming to Denver. So, I didn't mean to get off track there, but so you're going from this issue you're studying, you're examining your assumptions. Am I really focused on our assumptions valid? We've got to test those. The horizon scanning part. So horizon scanning is typically part of a single foresight exercise, but it is also something that is done outside of a particular exercise. So it's ongoing, is what I mean to say. So let's come back. Excuse me one sec. If we're looking at 4 different scenarios, how do you prepare for all of them? You can't, right? We can't invest lots of energy and resources into every plausible future in 10, 15 years. What gives you help in deciding is horizon scanning. So outside of the specific context of a certain foresight study, one does horizon scanning to see where there are weak signals of potential change, something on the horizon, something that's starting to crop up in social media around it. We're hearing more about it. And could this become a trend that eventually could interact with other key trends and influence our future in a significant way? Or maybe it's just a flash in the pan and falls off the table and we don't hear about it in 6 months. But ongoing horizon scanning can help you to see over a period of time, months or years, that scenario, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, is becoming more likely, or a big part of it, because what we're seeing from our ongoing horizon scanning we're doing daily or weekly is showing that something that is built into that scenario is looking more and more likely. So horizon scanning is so very important to the foresight process, not only within as you're addressing a particular question and working toward your scenarios, but once you're done with the study and you've got your scenarios, it's like ongoing monitoring and evaluation, if you will. Which of these scenarios do I really need to start paying more attention to and maybe putting more resources in? The last thing in terms of kind of the indicative process of doing foresight is using what comes out of it. So this comes back to your question also of why aren't leaders using foresight more? Part of it is it's scary. It's unsettling. It suggests change. If you're looking at scenarios that are 10 or 15 years, imagine Kodak, the Kodak moment, or that's not the only example of companies that weren't as quick to move to digital.
Correct.
In terms of photography and such. If they had been doing foresight and looking at 10, 15 years, there's certain technologies that are emerging that might change how people take pictures, right? They may not be printing them out at the local pharmacy, right? So some of the things that may come out of foresight studies scare the heck out of you. And decision makers may not just, they may look at that report and that's all very interesting. Thank you all. I want to appreciate the strategy department's efforts on this. Kudos. And then it kind of sits on the shelf because anyway, it's not a prediction. It's not specific. Right. No one's saying this is going to happen. And besides, it's 10 years on. And why, in some of these scenarios might suggest a fundamental reorientation of, in the case of a company, its strategy, manufacturing, what it invests in, or in the case of a government, maybe restructuring ministries, departments, how we're going to provide services, organize the civil service. So it's daunting. And to do a foresight study, and this gets a little tricky in the international realm, we're looking at foreign affairs and such. If you're working across borders, so there are international efforts at foresight in international organizations. And when you start talking frankly about, countries not liking each other or potentially going to war with each other, that's kind of delicate when you're talking in a room with people from different countries, and the elephant in the room is like, look, you've got this tension that could lead to something really horrible. And we have to think about this as a possibility. Sure. An invasion of Taiwan, practical example. I mean, in a lot of places, they don't want to necessarily talk too much about that, not in public, right? But if I can guarantee you that policymakers in Western and other capitals are looking at this, and not just a narrow geographic sense of mainland China from its perspective, taking back Taiwan. This would have global implications. Of course. Really global. And it affects supply chains, economies, not just. So I cite that example only to say that some things that should be included in big foresight reports, especially if they take on global issues, they can scare people away. Yeah. And rather not know.
It sounds like to me, companies are probably a lot more, I would say countries too, are a lot more comfortable with forecasting than they are with foresight, right? Because forecasting is what we were all taught in college and business class and economics and finance. So
it's dry numbers.
Right. Yeah.
I can point to the hard data.
Correct.
You look forward with foresight. It's like, what? You're imagining this possible. I mean, the technology is not finalized yet. There's hypotheticals involved in foresight.
Correct.
Forecasting, you've got those numbers. They're right there. The evidence is there.
Well, and I go back to your example of forecasting, which is the most simple, which is forecasting the weather, right? We look at the forecast. We know what we have to do to prepare for the weather for the day. It's got to be the same for big companies, for countries, et cetera, cities, right? And so I love that. I didn't really think of it that way until you really started to get into it and break it down. I want to take a pause real quick and talk about, one of the things driving this series of books is climate change, right? Climate change is real. And the reason I bring it up is because what we don't think about is population growth is also contributing to climate change, right? And you talk about some of this stuff in the book, but food safety, food security, even food scarcity, right? Scarcity, excuse me, which I found interesting. There's even an organization called Foresight for Food. So, whether we want to deny it or not, we need to use strategic foresight about climate change. There is global warming. I mean, we can track it, right? The temperature has gone up, and you talk about some of this in the book. I love the forward of the book, by the way. That gives a lot of great information too. It's written by, is it Thomas Lovejoy who wrote the forward for your book, right? Yeah. And so I just want to touch on that real quick because I want to get your opinion on foresight, strategic foresight for climate change, and then talk about those things that, we need to be looking at. Like I said, I warned you all in the beginning, there's so much we can do here and so deep we can go. We could probably use 5 hours to get through all of this.
Where to, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, where to start with climate change? Let's start with a small issue.
Yeah.
Right? Interestingly, for our audience, the morning that this is being taped, the COP26, the latest big international confab to negotiate on the next steps and agreements on climate change. Today, there was a seminar on the sidelines looking at the use of foresight in climate change.
Interesting.
So you are very prescient. You are right. You are tuned in ways you can't imagine.
All
right. Okay. In the models that have been developed in predicting the course of climate change, this has been done by statisticians, by climatologists, by scientists, environmentalists. So where does foresight come in? Okay, foresight wouldn't be telling you that climate change is likely. Let's assume that the scientists that the level of agreement that has been reached on humankind's contribution to climate change, it's pretty airtight at this point, right? There are a lot of questions about the pace, and with each passing day, there are more studies suggesting that pace is picking up, and we're getting into trouble if we keep emitting more carbon into the atmosphere. All right, so foresight, in short, what can it contribute? Well, climate change, for any big global or national question, climate change would have to be built into the assumptions of that this is going to be with us in 10, 15 years. We don't know in 10, 15 years, especially if it's a more localized situation, water supply in Denver. We don't know exactly what climate change is going to do in the next 10 years. There can be some educated guesses, and the modeling is trying to come down to the more localized level and such. We may have a clear idea with time, and also just what are we seeing? I mean, you have foresters, you have ranchers. It's not just it's not people in the ivory tower who are the only ones who are seeing it. People who are spending their time outdoors, who are depending on the land and natural resources, can talk about how things are changing on the ground. So foresight would be looking at, okay, this change is taking place, and then what happens? Okay. How will people interact? What will happen with the economy? What might climate change inspire people to do? So this is where the scenarios go, is the level of cooperation among people and governments at all levels, including beyond America's borders. This is what foresight would be doing, is including in the scenarios, look, there's climate change. Can't tell with precision what the impacts will be, again, if you're looking at a localized level in 10, 15 years, but it's probably this or probably that. You can come up with most plausible cases at this point of where climate change is going. Okay. And then how does that evolve? How does that affect the way that we interact in business, in society, in life, in our governance? So the scenarios would be around how things are shaping up differently because of climate change, as well as other major developments, including technology advances there.
Yeah, it's interesting. My real job, I work in finance. I work in the private real estate sector, and I should say residential. And I interviewed a gentleman recently who was a chief economist at Freddie Mac, and he talked about how, and you wouldn't think about this, and I'm going to tie this together real quick. He talked about how climate change is affecting and will continue to affect housing and housing finance here. Is affecting and will continue to affect housing and housing finance here. And it's like nobody puts things like that together, right? And we've been using example water. Their lakes are at the lowest levels they've been, I think, probably ever, or in the last however many years. And it's a real problem. I want to ask you a question that's a little bit outside of the book, just real quick, talking about climate change. And I asked Tim this same question, and I'd love to ask this. They recently had the summit where they talked about climate change, and China and Russia did not show up. And, the question that I have, and I've asked everybody, is, here in the US, I know you're in Canada, our countries can do everything to to affect climate in a positive way, or climate change in a positive way. But what if we don't get these guys on board that contribute to some of the greatest pollution in our planet?
On that last question, well, we're in big trouble. I'm hoping that the no-shows, Putin and Xi not showing up at COP26 in Scotland, that this is a temporary thing. It's maybe a snub to the U.S. as a leading force in trying to promote action on climate change. In the case of China, it actually has been doing quite a number of things to address climate change. If one looks at commitments made about, for example, financing coal abroad, about commitments on emissions, it's not enough to get the world below what the experts are telling us in terms of temperature increase, the famous 1.5 to 2 degrees. China's commitments, China is one of the largest economies and will become even larger with the passage of time. It's got to bring its emissions down. So, what does that mean? What if we can't get them on board? We're in big trouble. I think Russia, it's a huge country, the largest land mass of any country in the world, but its population is declining. China is really the one to focus on. India, which will soon become the most populous country in the world, did come out with a statement on when it hopes to achieve net zero emissions. Granted, it's a long way off. It's 2070, but keep in mind, this is still a lower middle income country with huge development challenges and tens and tens of millions of people living in extreme poverty. So they have a lot of social challenges. They're going to need development. I guess a short look, one way of looking at this is like the US and Canada, where I am, have over time disproportionately contributed to climate change. If you look like emissions 100%. Per person, that has to be taken into account to a certain degree. And China, as wealthy as it's become and influential and powerful, it still has a much lower per capita income. And in rural Western China, there are people who are going without things we take for granted in North America in terms of access to quality, affordable health care or running water, or, there are pollution issues, et cetera, et cetera. So, China's got to develop more. And unfortunately, it's happening at a time where if they follow the same path that the U.S. and Western Europe did, or Australia or Canada, the world's doomed. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's, I guess, trying to be in their shoes for a moment. The world is asking China to cut back. And everybody needs that, including the Chinese. At the same time, the West had the luxury of growing however it wanted to grow, and pollute however it wanted to pollute and emit how much it would, how much was emitted. So there's a lot of delicate negotiations, and I think people looking, sitting, trying to put each other, sit and put yourself in somebody else's shoes when you start that conversation. I don't think demonizing is going to be helpful, but it's absolutely essential that China show up for these events and that they continue to strive for more ambitious cuts in emissions. At the same time, the U.S. and other countries need to really, those who are quote unquote most responsible for bringing us to where we are, really need to follow through on commitments and try to and help other countries. I'm not thinking so much China here as developing countries without the means, but that are also going to be growing and contributing more to the problem if they follow a Western growth path. Think of middle-income countries like Nigeria or Indonesia or Pakistan with hundreds of millions of people, and again, they cannot have a development path like the West did, or we're finished.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a phenomenal answer, by the way. I love it, and I know that was off topic, but somebody with your experience and your intellect, I wanted to just get your point of view, and thank you for sharing that. Man, time is going by so quickly here, and we're about halfway through everything I had. So, I guess the question that I would have is with all of this, what do you think lies ahead for the United States and or Canada, where you are moving forward? what do you think the post-pandemic world looks for us? And then we'll tie it back to the book. Do you think that more companies, organizations, and governments will start to use strategic foresight to better prepare for the future?
Okay, a couple of different.
I know there's a lot there.
What's going to come next? And then our companies and governments are going to use for it more. Let me start with the easier question. That's the second one. So they're going to use it more. And I know this because I talk to fellow specialists in strategic foresight and futurists and see what's happening in the field. And during the pandemic, aided by Zoom and other technologies where people were connecting, it seems more and more virtually with distance mattering less and less. You have communities that are growing. For example, in the Philippines, where I spent time there during the pandemic, they established a Philippine Futures Association that involves government experts, academics, and others interested in the future and helping to shape it in the Philippines. In the U.S., in the federal departments and agencies in Washington, of course, they have satellites across the U.S. There are people in these different parts of the government who are doing foresight or foresight-related work, and they've had for several years an informal, what they call community of interest, where they share information, experience. They'd bring in experts from the outside and from within government to help build a professional cadre, right? This has exploded during the pandemic. And you've also had new initiatives, more training, more government departments setting up offices to do strategic foresight. So these are just a handful of examples. The other day, I was hearing about some of the trainings of the University of Houston. So as it happens in foresight, University of Houston is one of the leading educational centers for giving degrees and doing training, like mid-career training, that sort of thing in foresight. And they're training dozens and dozens and dozens of U.S. government officials. So I'm not going to go there, but I could go abroad and cite other examples. Just two, Greece and Spain in the last 2 years have set up foresight units at the center of government. So right up near the president or prime minister. So they are near, power centers and can influence decision making. And Spain its new foresight office just did a scenarios exercise looking at Spain in the year 2050. Okay, so this is all happening, and it's been encouraged by the pandemic. People were knocked off their chairs, and there's a desire among decision makers to get a bit more organized and to try to anticipate other things that might, other risks and developments where there might be opportunities. In the corporate world, similarly, I'm seeing more and more companies hiring futurists or foresight specialists coming out of universities like Houston and others. And so that's definitely happening on the corporate side. Only about 1 out of 4 Fortune 500 companies have dedicated in-house capacity on foresight, according to some research that's been done. I would expect that number to be rising, that share. Sure. Now, what do I see come out of the pandemic? I don't characterize myself as a futurist, although the future fascinates me, and I do watch trends. There are a number of things that are happening around us that in the next handful of years, in this decade. So let's not think even way into the future, into the galaxy. This decade, what we're going to see. Some things that happened during the pandemic: the acceleration of technological take-up and innovation. 5G is coming. The Internet of Things is coming. Something that it got some attention with Facebook rebranding as Meta, but even before that, this whole idea of the metaverse, so virtual connected worlds, and if you had an Oculus headset where you could go interact and play games, you've got Roblox, a platform for kids, Minecraft, and other such platforms that tend toward the younger population from primary and secondary school and young adults. This has exploded in ways, this whole space, in ways that I think a lot of older people, say 25 and up, don't fully appreciate. And so Zuckerberg's announcement that, okay, they're going all in on the metaverse, it struck some as a surprise. And what's all this about? And what does that mean? I think it's not a surprise at all to younger people who have been flocking away from Facebook into other social media like TikTok, for example. And in fact, one scenario, I'll share this with you. It sounds a bit more fanciful, but let's see what happens in 2035 when this scenario is tied to. The OECD, this is not in the book, it came out after the book. So the OECD, it's kind of a think tank research body for the wealthy democracies, and they do policy coordination, try and get like-minded countries like in Western Europe and North America to collaborate and coordinate on good policies. They have a big unit. Well, it's not big, but they have a influential and a productive team working on foresight issues, and they do regular convening of government officials. Anyway, they did a scenario exercise to 2035. It was released this year, and one of their scenarios envisions in 2035 the world living largely in a metaverse. Now, this sounds absolutely absurd and sci-fi like, right? And take it with a grain of salt, and it's not a prediction, and it's just it's a bit of storytelling as you have in foresight. But when you see what Facebook just did, and if you take a closer look at performers like Ariana Grande, who performed in the last 3 months, she performed virtually on one of these youth-oriented platforms, and hundreds of thousands of people attended her live concert, which was not in the physical world; it was in a virtual world. And this is exploding. And also during the pandemic, you had much more use of virtual reality and augmented reality, not just for play and for escapism and I need a break from these difficult times, but being used for training, for example. We couldn't get together in classrooms and in training centers, so VR was being used increasingly for training purposes in a variety of sectors. And that's just a half step to interacting with avatars. So I would just say, watch this space. Next year in Orlando, Disney World is going to offer an immersive experience around Star Wars. Now, I don't know the last time you were at an amusement park, but when I went more often, when I was much younger, there were great rides you wanted to go on, and haunted house and that sort of, but the thing about those experiences is they were always the same. Mm-hmm. That ride was great. Let's do it again. Everything was mechanized, but it's set up to do one set of things, and you're in and out in 2 minutes. This apparently is going to be immersive and adaptive. So you go in with your group, you see a figure from Star Wars, a hologram,
right?
And apparently that hologram feeds off of what you're saying. You turn to your loved one, whoever's in the park with you, and you make some comment overheard by the the system, and they react accordingly. I mean, this is happening next year.
Amazing.
So I'm just saying, for government officials, for companies are starting to get it, and they're going to be investing in some big sums of money to reach young people in the metaverse. And it's going to have implications well beyond entertainment and amusement. The last thought on that is just an example of this here in Canada, about e-games, esports, which have become very, very big, right? And it's mostly young guys at that laptop going crazy and in the big screen of what's happening, right? They are building a brand new sports arena. You think, basketball, hockey. No, this is for esports. This is for fans to come sit, thousands of fans in the city of Toronto, biggest city in Canada, to watch esports.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And by the way, you answered a lot of my questions during that, because I was going to ask you, do you think foresight will be taught in schools or universities? And yes, it already is, which is amazing. I think you'll see that grow as we move forward, which is exciting. You do mention OECD in the book, because I have it in my notes. It stands for, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, correct?
That's right.
So we are literally out of time, and we still have about half of it left to do. So I'm definitely going to have you back. But before I let you go, a couple of questions. So if my listeners want to find more information on strategic foresight and go deeper, what do you think some of the best resources would be for them?
Well, it's a little selfish, but you set me up there. I'd say start with the book, Learning from Tomorrow. But for free, you can follow me on Twitter at Big Trends Guy altogether. And I'm constantly sharing new developments, trends, scenario exercises, foresight studies, sharing the love and trying to highlight good work that's being done by a variety of organizations. And a lot of that, it provides free access. So I'd say that's an easy place to start. There are a few associations, foundations that engage in future studies. Those are the types of things that I flag on my Twitter
and
site.
You have a blog as well, correct?
I do. It's on Medium, which is a site where a lot of people share their content. And there again, it's under Big Trends.
Okay,
Guy.
I'll make sure I put those in the show notes. I've been following your blog, and some great information there. I just want to thank you. I mean, and I think you would agree, we scratched the surface of this. Excuse me. Excuse me. We only scratched the surface of this. I recommend you read this book, guys that are listening. It's a great book. Bart, you said at the beginning of this, it's not just for countries, not just for organizations or companies. You can utilize this within your family dynamic. There's so much to be done here. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time, being here with us today and sharing your knowledge. Definitely the smartest guy on this call.
I don't know about that, Michael, but I'll tell you, I really did appreciate this opportunity. The Daily Decision is doing some great work. You've had some fantastic interviews with some really inspirational people. And I encourage folks after this particular exchange to tune in to future episodes with other speakers. And I look forward to our next conversation whenever that might be.
Me as well. We'll definitely have you back in the near future, Bart. And I appreciate it. For those of you guys listening, of course, this is the Daily Decision. If you enjoyed this, please share it, like it, tell your friends about it. And remember, it all starts with a decision.